I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truths, where history, horror, and humanity collide. Kansas City had gangsters, but Johnny Lazia was something else. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He owned the streets, the politicians, the bootleg routes, and the votes. He was Tom Pendergast's right hand and KC's most feared fixer. And then one summer night in 1934, the king of Kansas City walked out of St. Joseph's Hospital and straight into a wall of machine-gun fire. The city erupted, the newspapers screamed, and the cracks in KC's criminal political empire finally split open. Tonight, we're going inside the murder that changed Kansas City forever. The assassination of Johnny Lazia. This is Deadly Truths. Johnny Lazia didn't come from royalty. He built himself into it. Born Anthony Lazio in 1895, he grew up in Kansas City's North End, a neighborhood already simmering with bootleggers, card rooms, political ward bosses, and the early bones of what would become the Kansas City Mafia. As a teenager, he wasn't the quiet, forgettable type. He gravitated to gambling halls, saloons, and the men who ran them. Kansas City's North End wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a world with its own rules. A tight grid of tenements, bakeries, backroom social clubs, and immigrant families who lived door to door and watched out for their own. Italians called it Little Italy. Everyone else called it the North End. But the police had a different name for it, the place where nobody talks. In those narrow streets, people didn't call the cops. They called a cousin or a padrone or a man like Johnny Lazia. Power didn't come from City Hall. It came from who you knew, who owed you, and who you protected. Neighborhood loyalty was currency. Silence was policy. And outsiders knew better than to ask questions twice. That's the soil Lazia grew out of, a world where the church bells rang every morning. Pasta dried on clotheslines in the alleys, and political favors were traded as casually as loaves of bread. By day, it looked like any immigrant neighborhood trying to survive the Depression. By night, it was a maze of gambling rooms, bootlegging routes, and backdoor meetings where deals were made in whispers. And here's the subtext that matters. Lazia wasn't an intruder in the North End. He was its native son. He didn't install himself there, he was built by it. The neighborhood shaped his instincts, his alliances, his toughness, and his sense of owed loyalty. So when people later asked how one man could control so many corners of Kansas City, the real answer was simple. He came from a place where control was inherited, not voted on, where reputation didn't come from a title, but from whether people stepped aside when you walked down the block. And today, the North End is gone, carved up by highways and redevelopment, renamed Columbus Park. But if you stand there long enough, you can still feel the outline of what it used to be, a neighborhood built on family, secrecy, and the unspoken understanding that some problems were handled internally. That's the world that made Johnny Lazia, and that's the world that started to crack the moment he lost control. By his early 20s, he'd already racked up arrests, burglary, gambling, weapons charges. But here's the key. He kept getting out. That wasn't luck. That was politics. Lazia connected himself to the most powerful machine in the Midwest, the Pendergast organization. Tom Pendergast ran Kansas City from behind the curtain. Election fraud, patronage jobs, protection rackets, and the entire Democratic machine. Lazia didn't just work for him, he became his enforcer, his fixer, and eventually his public face in the underworld. By the late 1920s, Lazia controlled bootlegging routes, gambling dens, protection territories, bombings for hire, political intimidation crews, election stuffing operations, and he did it in the open. Silk suits, big cars, front row seats at civic events, photographed with politicians and businessmen. He cultivated charm because charm hides power until you need the blade. During Prohibition, Lazia's empire exploded. The money was endless, and the Pendergast machine insulated him from law enforcement. Even when the FBI opened files on him, even when newspapers whispered his name, nothing stuck. By the early 1930s, Johnny Lazia wasn't just a gangster. He was Kansas City's mob boss and political broker, a man who could get you elected, protect your business, or destroy your career with a single phone call. But that kind of power paints a target on your back. And by 1934, internal tensions, outside pressure from the Chicago outfit, political shifts, and betrayals inside his own organization were tightening around him. Johnny Lazia was on top of the world, but everyone on top is already falling. To understand the murder, you have to understand the ecosystem Johnny Lazia thrived in. Kansas City in the 1920s wasn't just corrupt, it was engineered that way. At the top sat Tom Pendergast, the political boss who ran the city like a private corporation. Under him were lieutenants, union heads, bookmakers, enforcers, ward captains, and the local mafia, a loose network sometimes called the North End Gang. Lazia was the perfect bridge between these worlds, smart enough to navigate politics, tough enough to control the streets, and charismatic enough to keep the public calm while the machine tightened its grip. He wasn't operating in a vacuum. The pressures around him shaped every move he made. By the early 1930s, the Pendergast machine didn't hint at consequences. It delivered them. Kansas City was a boomtown built on vice, graft, and political obedience, and when someone stepped out of line, the warning arrived in the form of shattered glass and detonated walls. One of the most infamous examples was the campaign of intimidation aimed at the Kansas City Art Institute. On paper, the Art Institute had nothing to do with organized crime, but in Kansas City, everything was political. The Institute's leadership publicly criticized the Pendergast regime, questioned the machine's grip on city funds, and backed candidates Pendergast wanted crushed. That was enough. Late-night detonations ripped through parts of the grounds. Cars parked near the building were torched. Anonymous letters circulated. Reform-minded donors suddenly withdrew support. People understood exactly what was happening because this wasn't an isolated event. It was the machine reminding the city who owned it. When buildings blew up in Kansas City, the police response was predictable. No suspects, no arrests, no real investigation. Everything conveniently disappeared into paperwork. Behind the scenes, Johnny Lazia wasn't necessarily the bomber, but he was the coordinator. His crews were the connective tissue between the political machine and the street-level muscle. If a reformer needed to be scared, Lazia knew who to call. If a building needed to burn to make a point, he made sure it burned at the right time, on the right block, and with maximum public effect. This was Lazia's genius. He controlled violence without always committing it. He delivered messages without signing his name. He made sure every explosion carried the same signature threat. Cross the machine and you won't just lose an election. You'll lose something that can't be replaced. This culture of political terrorism set the stage for everything that followed. Kansas City was primed for violence, cracking under corruption and circling with paranoia. So, when Lazia himself became the target of an ambush in 1934, the city recognized the pattern immediately. Power had shifted, and the machine was devouring its own. The Pendergast machine treated elections like theater, ballot boxes hijacked, polling places secured by armed men, dead people voting, opponents intimidated or vanished. Lazia's crews handled the dirty work, the muscle, and the street-level coordination. It wasn't subtle, but it worked. Pendergast's candidates always won, and every victory strengthened Lazia's protection. During Prohibition, Lazia's people managed truck routes, warehouse protection, payoff lists, and controlled shipments coming in from the Chicago outfit. This is where friction started. Chicago wanted more money. Lazia wasn't giving it. The outfit doesn't take no well. Lazia built a huge empire, and that empire attracted ambitious men who wanted his chair. Names like Charles Gargata and associates inside the North End began gaining ground. Rivalries grew quiet but sharp. Someone wanted him weakened. Someone wanted him gone. After 1932, the feds were done playing. They were investigating Pendergast's machine, the outfit, election crimes, and the KC underworld. Lazia was suddenly carrying the weight of tax investigations. racketeering probes, political scrutiny, enemies circling inside his organization. The walls were closing in from every angle. By 1934, the Kansas City machine was cracking. And when a machine cracks, someone always gets sacrificed. That someone was Johnny Lazia. By the summer of 1934, Johnny Lazia knew the ground under him was shifting. Federal investigators were turning over stones. Rivals inside the North End were circling. Chicago was pushing back on money. And Tom Pendergast, the man whose loyalty had protected him for years, was quietly stepping away. Lazia wasn't in hiding. He was doing what powerful men do when they feel pressure. He kept his routines. On the night of July 9th, heading into the early hours of July 10th, Lazia drove to St. Joseph's Hospital to check on a friend recovering from a routine surgery. That's how normal this night was supposed to be. A quick visit, a familiar drive, nothing unusual. He wasn't alone. His two bodyguards, Charles Carollo and Joe DeLuca, were with him. But here's the part that matters. Security was lighter than usual. Only one bodyguard walked with him. Another stayed near the car. Lazia's confidence had always been his armor. But confidence is also the thing that gets men killed. Around 3 a.m., Lazia came out through the hospital's side entrance on Prospect Avenue, the entrance doctors used, not patients. A dark sedan was waiting at the curb, engine running. Witnesses later told police they saw the silhouette of a second car idling down the block with its lights off. No one reacted. Kansas City was used to shadowy cars at night. The truth was simple. The shooters were already in position. As Lazia walked toward his vehicle, someone called out his name. He turned. That's when the machine guns opened up. Two men stepped out from the shadows near the retaining wall. They weren't nervous. They weren't rushing. They were executing a job, witnesses heard. A Thompson submachine gun, a shotgun, automatic pistol fire. The bodyguards tried to return fire, but it was over in seconds. Lazia was hit multiple times, chest, abdomen, hip, and legs. Carollo was shot through the hand. DeLuca was struck across the thigh. The shooters didn't flee in a panic. They walked back to their vehicle, climbed in, and disappeared into the night. No pursuit, no plate numbers, no names. Kansas City woke up to a mob king bleeding on a hospital walkway. Even as doctors rushed him inside, Lazia stayed conscious long enough to do one thing. He refused to name his killers. That was the code. That was the culture. And that silence protected someone powerful, someone who knew where he'd be, someone who knew his routine, someone inside his own world. When word spread that Johnny Lazia had been gunned down outside St. Joseph's Hospital, Kansas City understood instantly. This wasn't a random hit. This was a statement. The machine had turned inward, and the king was the first to fall. Chaos ripped through St. Joseph's Hospital the second the gunfire stopped. Nurses ducked behind desk counters. Orderlies froze mid-hallway. A night shift janitor later said the sound didn't echo like pistols, it rolled like thunder. Lazia's two men, Charles Carollo and Joe DeLuca, scrambled to pull him inside, leaving a trail of blood from the sidewalk to the admitting desk. He was still conscious, but barely. According to later medical summaries printed in the newspapers and testimony cited in crime hearings, Lazia had multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen, rounds through his hip and legs, a severe bleed from a stomach perforation, additional grazing wounds. It wasn't sloppy work. The shooters aimed to destroy vital organs, not intimidate. The attending physician, whose name appears across period reporting, immediately ordered emergency surgery. But the internal damage was catastrophic. His vitals crashed twice on the table. And yet he held on, long enough for what would become the most controversial moment of the entire case. While he drifted in and out of consciousness, a detective asked Lazia the standard question, "Johnny, who did this?" According to multiple accounts, Lazia shook his head and whispered, "I'll take care of it myself." He didn't snitch. He didn't name a rival. He died loyal to the culture that raised him, even if that culture might have ordered the hit. Kansas City police arrived to a crime scene they were reluctant to touch. This was Pendergast territory, and detectives knew better than to kick open political landmines unless someone gave the order, and nobody did. No immediate roadblocks, no dragnet, no press blackout. The case was already being muffled, and that silence was as loud as the gunfire that killed him. Johnny Lazia died the following morning, July 10, 1934, after hours of surgery and repeated internal hemorrhaging. He was 38 years old, the king of Kansas City's underworld, political broker, mob boss, fixer, and enforcer, was gone. And now the question wasn't how he died. It was who had the power to kill the man who once controlled everything. Once Johnny Lazia was dead, Kansas City didn't ask if it was a hit. They asked which powerful man finally decided he was expendable. Because killing Lazia wasn't casual. It required muscle, planning, political permission, and the kind of confidence only someone high up the chain could possess. Here are the 4 real theories historians, FBI files, and Senate organized crime reports circle around. Inside the North End, Lazia wasn't just a boss, he was blocking other men's ambitions. 2 names rise to the top: Charles Gargotta, a violent, unpredictable enforcer, long-standing rival for influence, deeply tied to the local mafia structure. Tony Gizzo, quiet, calculating, politically protected, ascended rapidly after Lazia's death. Both men benefited massively from Lazia being removed, and both were close enough to know his routines, his weaknesses, and his nightly habits. Why this theory holds? His killers knew exactly where he'd be. You only get that intel from inside. During Prohibition, Lazia's empire made a fortune off bootlegging, and Chicago wanted a bigger cut. He said no. Chicago didn't like no. The outfit was pressuring KC hard in the early 30s, especially through men like Frank Needy and Paul Ricca. Chicago had the firepower, the professionalism, and the interstate cover to pull off a clean, disciplined hit like this. The shooting was executed like a professional outfit job. Short bursts, controlled fire, clean escape, no chaotic spray. Tom Pendergast was still powerful, but cracks were forming. Federal investigations were heating up. Election fraud charges were escalating. Tax probes were starting to hit the machine. Lazia had become a liability. Too loud, too flashy, too connected to crimes the feds could actually prove. A quiet political deal could have been struck, remove Lazia to stabilize the machine. Pendergast didn't avenge him, didn't retaliate, didn't send his men on a rampage. For a man who owed Lazia everything, that silence is damning. Some historians believe the feds indirectly engineered his fall by targeting his income streams, seizing political allies, freezing his operations, forcing internal factions to scramble for power. If the federal squeeze caused panic inside KC's underworld, removing Lazia might have been a strategic move by second-tier bosses trying to survive. KC was under massive federal heat the exact year he was killed. Power redistribution always follows pressure. So who did it? The truth is the same truth that runs through every organized crime murder. The men who ordered it benefited, and the men who carried it out were never arrested. But the strongest theory, the one most historians fall back on, is a combination: Chicago pressure plus internal betrayal plus political permission. A perfect storm. Lazia was too big, too loud, too politically radioactive, and everyone who mattered had a reason to get him out of the way. Johnny Lazia, late H.C., wasn't just a gangster. He was the man who made Kansas City move. So when news broke that he'd been machine-gunned outside St. Joseph's, the city went into a kind of emotional whiplash. Not grief, not celebration, but fear. Because if he could be killed, then nobody was really protected anymore. By sunrise, every front page in the city was on fire with headlines. Reporters camped outside the hospital, outside morgues, outside his home. Editors rewrote pages 3 and 4 times because new details kept surfacing every hour. and the tone was unmistakable. This was the biggest mob hit in Kansas City history. Lazia's funeral at Holy Rosary Catholic Church in the North End was a spectacle. Half mourning, half political theater. Who showed up? Local businessmen, politicians who needed to be seen, quiet men from the North End, union leaders, enforcers dressed in black, Pendergast machine operatives, ordinary neighborhood families. People stood shoulder to shoulder on the sidewalks surrounding the church. But here's the striking part. Almost nobody talked. The silence wasn't respect, it was caution. Everyone was watching everyone else. Who was crying? Who wasn't? Who looked nervous? Who looked relieved? Funerals in organized crime cities aren't just goodbyes, they're surveillance. Lazia's death exposed the fractures Pendergast had been trying to plaster over. The federal probes, the bootlegging income drying up, the election fraud indictments, rivalries inside the machine, the Chicago pressure, the growing mafia political tension. People started asking the question no machine wants in print. If Lazia wasn't safe, who is? City officials gave carefully scripted statements. Detectives pretended to be actively pursuing leads. Politicians offered condolences but avoided saying his name. The cracks were visible now. Kansas City wasn't unified in how it processed the murder. North End families, they mourned. They knew him as a protector, a man who handled neighborhood problems, a bridge between immigrants and city power. Middle-class KC residents, they were stunned, rattled, afraid of escalation. If machine gun hits happened at hospitals, where was safe? Political insiders, they got quiet, way too quiet. Criminal rivals, they moved fast. Within weeks, territories shifted. Within months, Lazia's old operations were absorbed by men with far fewer scruples and far closer ties to Chicago. The press kept digging, and the truth got uglier. By late 1935, Senate committees and the FBI had files thick enough to choke a filing cabinet. And the messy truth was obvious. Lazia didn't fall by accident. He was removed. Kansas City was never the same. The assassination didn't just kill a man. It marked the beginning of the end for the Pendergast machine and the start of decades of federal pressure that reshaped the city's political and criminal landscape. If the assassination of Johnny Lazia was loud, the investigation was whisper quiet. Police questioned witnesses, filled out forms, and walked crime scenes. But it was theater. Everyone in Kansas City knew it. The men running the investigation weren't in control. The machine was. And that meant one thing. Nothing real was ever going to make it onto paper. Detectives interviewed hospital staff. They questioned his bodyguards, Charles Carollo and Joe DeLuca. They looked at the bullet casings. It was the underworld's version of the Miranda warning. Lazia's men weren't talking because they knew exactly what he had said on his deathbed. I'll take care of it myself. That wasn't defiance. That was instruction. The suspects who should have been questioned and never were. Names floated immediately. Charles Gargota, unpredictable, violent, resentful of Lazia's power. Tony Gizzo, a quiet climber who moved into Lazia's vacuum with no resistance. Chicago outfit intermediaries, men who had warned KC months earlier about profit sharing. But here's what happened. None of those men were ever seriously interrogated. Not one, because to question them was to question the Pendergast machine, and that was a career-ending move in 1934 Kansas City. Lazia's 2 injured bodyguards recovered. Carollo got 3 fingers mangled and a bullet crease on the scalp. DeLuca took a clean shot through the thigh. Either man could have turned the case. Neither did. Within days, both were back in the North End, not hiding, not afraid, not under pressure. That tells you everything. If the killers were outsiders, Carollo and DeLuca would have been dead next. But they weren't, because the killers were insiders, protected by the same machine that protected them. Within 6 weeks, the investigation hit lack of evidence. Not because there wasn't evidence, but because nobody with real power wanted it found. With Lazia gone, Kansas City reorganized itself almost overnight. And in the end, the assassination of Johnny Lazia was never solved because it was never meant to be solved. Every man who could have talked didn't. Every man who benefited stayed quiet. Every path forward led back to someone powerful. Lazia died loyal to the machine, and the machine thanked him by burying the truth with him. Johnny Lazia didn't just die on a hospital sidewalk. His assassination detonated a chain reaction that restructured power, rewrote alliances, and shaped Kansas City's underworld for half a century. Here's what his death set in motion. Lazia was the bridge between the Italian immigrant neighborhoods, the political machine, the street crews, the business elites. When he died, that bridge snapped. The North End lost its stabilizing force, not a saint, but a predictable one. His death accelerated the breakup of the old neighborhood loyalties. The next generation of mobsters didn't care about the community the same way he did. They cared about money, expansion, and survival. Chicago slid in and never let go. Before Lazia's death, Kansas City had autonomy. After he was gone, the Chicago outfit moved in like a corporate takeover. They influenced leadership. They controlled bootlegging remnants. They tightened gambling operations. They prepared KC for its biggest future cash stream, Las Vegas. KC went from being its own empire to being a well-paid satellite. That arrangement lasted almost 5 decades. Gizzo's era set the stage for Vegas skimming. Tony Gizzo wasn't flashy, but he became one of the most important post-war mob architects in KC. He organized rackets with greater structure, tighter financial controls, national connections. This laid the groundwork for KC's long-running casino skim operations in Vegas, a federal case that would later involve the Tropicana, Stardust, and Argent Corporation. You can trace that entire pipeline, millions in unreported casino cash, back to the vacuum created by Lazia's death. Charles Gargata gained boldness and influence after Lazia was gone. That rise led directly to the Beniagio Gargota murders in 1950. Bodies found in a political clubhouse. Shell casings scattered across the scene dripping with corruption. A scandal so big Congress couldn't ignore it. This triggered the Kefauver Committee, the first national televised investigation into organized crime. Kansas City became a case study for corruption, political entanglement, and mob influence. Without Lazia's death, Gargata doesn't rise, Beniagio doesn't die, and the national spotlight doesn't hit KC. Lazia was Pendergast's hammer. He kept enemies quiet, elections in line, and money flowing. Once he died, federal cases sped up, witnesses grew bolder, political rivals moved in, and Pendergast himself became vulnerable. 5 years later, the boss of bosses went down on tax charges. Without Lazia, the machine couldn't hold its structure. His death helped bring down the most powerful political organization in Missouri history. From the 1940s through the 1980s, the KC mob was small but influential, infiltrating labor unions, running Teamsters operations, influencing trucking routes, controlling gambling and bookmaking, sending men to oversee Vegas interests, participating in multi-city national meetings of mob families. This sophistication didn't come from nowhere. It came from leaders who learned one lesson from Lazia's murder. Power must be distributed, not concentrated. One king is easier to kill than a council. KC adopted that model, and it worked for decades. You still hear it today. Kansas City isn't a mob town. That myth exists because of Lazia's death, because the men who replaced him hid more effectively, moved quieter, and kept the scandals behind union doors, casino offices, and political backrooms. KC went from a loud gangster city to a subtle, sophisticated, organized crime hub. That evolution, that change in style, began the night Lazia died. Johnny Lazia's assassination didn't close a chapter. It opened an era. It transformed Kansas City from a street-level bootlegger's haven into a structured, nationally connected, politically insulated mob city. 50 years of criminal evolution began with a few seconds of controlled gunfire on a hospital sidewalk. Johnny Lazia, wasn't an innocent man cut down in the street. He was a political enforcer, a racketeer, and a man whose rise was built on intimidation, corruption, and violence. And yes, he was responsible for harm, not always as the trigger man, but as the one who ordered, approved, or enabled it. Under his watch, Kansas City saw bombings used as political pressure, election theft and voter intimidation, beatings carried out on dissenters, neighborhood rackets that bled immigrants dry, violence tied to bootlegging and labor control, and multiple underworld killings linked to his crews. The victims of Kansas City's machine weren't mobsters. They were immigrants who couldn't vote without being threatened, reformers whose homes were burned or bombed, working families shaken down by protection rackets, small business owners strong-armed for political loyalty, police officers silenced or outgunned, communities forced to live under corruption they didn't ask for. These are the people history forgets when it glorifies men like Lazia, and they're the people who deserve the tribute. Because the truth is simple. Lazia didn't fall because he was good. He fell because he made enemies even more powerful than himself. His assassination didn't end corruption, but it exposed it. And it helped crack open the machine that had ruled Kansas City for decades. You've been listening to Deadly Truths with Becca, where we dig into the history, the horror, and the humanity behind America's darkest stories. If you found this episode compelling, follow, rate, and share on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. It helps keep these forgotten histories alive, and it pushes these stories back into the light where they belong. Research and narration are always done by me. Sources for this episode include Kansas City Star Archives, FBI Kansas City Field Records, Missouri Valley Special Collections, Senate Organized Crime Committee reports, historical accounts of the Pendergast machine, and remember, the past